So Orage, since you are officially vice chair in your role as president of the Conservancy, or chair of the Conservancy board, will you call the meeting to order and ask for any public comment?
Certainly, I will do that. Let's call this meeting of the Leadership Committee to order. The first order of business is public comments. Any public comments out there?
Anyone that's joined from the public, if you use the raise hand function within Zoom, I can ask you to unmute yourself if you'd like to make a comment.
Uh-oh. Where's Doug?
Michael, do we not have any public comments?
There's no public comments. Nobody's raised their hand at this moment now.
Okay, hearing none, then let's move to the next agenda item. Kate?
So that will be the approval of minutes, Orage. So if you could ask for a motion and second for the approval of the minutes.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
Move for approval,
Carlton?
Corey.
Carlton?
I'll second Corey's motion.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please raise your hand. Ayes have it. Next item.
Donna, over to you for the community committee report.
Thanks, Kate, and good morning, everyone. As you know, I'm actually happy for one time that we're virtual, so I could join you from Ohio. Tonight will be the summer meeting for the community committee. It's going to focus on three things. The Equity Task Force will present a definition of equity for the park and a narrative describing how it was created. The Park Improvements Task Force is going to present a refined list of recommended improvements for early park improvements for phase 2. And then the Park Partnerships Group will give an update on the park partnerships process and give an update on concessions and food partnerships for the park, which is going to be such a great activation, hopefully a way to leverage some resources. And then directly after that, they're going to be hosting a social happy hour in the Sunflower Field. And I'm so sad to miss that, actually. For the community members and their family and the leadership committee, you all are invited as well to join. So sorry for the late invite. It'll begin roughly around 7:15 and food and drinks will be provided. Kate and Nick, is there anything else you'd want to add? Great, thank you.
Any other questions for Shauna? Hearing none, we'll go to the next agenda item.
Thank you, Orage. So, there's Nancy. The next agenda item is the FY22 budget request from the city of Raleigh to the Dix Park Conservancy. In your backup packet that you received last week, there was a memo with the actual budget request, and I'm going to just share my screen to remind everyone of that process. So just as a reminder, in 2020, we signed a revised funding agreement with the Dix Park Conservancy, which outlined a process for the city to request funds to the Conservancy. And the process is that I, as the city's project manager, and Oscar work through that budget request. We present it to the leadership committee. The leadership committee makes a recommendation and then presents it to the president of the Conservancy. And Janet is actually unable to join us today. And then Janet would take it to her board for review and approval. So that's the process that's outlined in the funding agreement. The actual request is a couple of things, and the detail is provided in your backup packet, but we have requested a contingency of $350,000 to be executed only if needed to support the Plaza Play project. So that's not money directly coming to the city. That is a request for additional funds if needed to support the finalization of the Plaza Play project. The Conservancy did commit $15,000 to one of our state grants as a match for the creek restoration work. And then the last three categories are basically our park operations funds. So programs and events includes all of the funding for, multitasking, all of the funding for FY22 programs and events, including the Fall Powwow, the Falling for Local, and then spring and summer events as well. The planning money supports not only our transition back to in-person meetings for this group, but also for the community committee and other outreach and engagement efforts. And then early park improvements. This would be our second round of early park improvements. The first funding went to things like the Magnolia and Oak Room, the Hammock Forest, the trail build. So this would be the amount of money for supporting FY22 early park improvements. So it's a total of about $400,000. I will note that we reduced these numbers by about 20–25%, just given kind of everything coming out of the pandemic, and feel like this is kind of a solid foundation for us to operate the park and deliver great programs and events, which the Conservancy completely funds. The request is for this group to discuss this and make a recommendation to approve the funding request to take it to the Dix Park Conservancy Board, but I'm happy to answer any questions and share anything from the backup packet.
Questions for Kate regarding the funding requests for fiscal year 22? Hearing none. Oh,
Sorry, I
Alicia?
do have one. Kate, the total says 403. Is that the total of just the new requests for those last three?
That's correct.
The math doesn't follow. Okay, so that is the part that we're being asked to recommend. The other two that are previously approved, correct?
Yeah, sorry, that's a good
Okay.
point. The contingency money is not included in that 403.
Okay.
And Kate, when you reduced the amount, was there a big item or just a number of items that helped you reduce it that 25%?
One is we looked, programs and events are very popular at Dix Park, but we have a capacity issue in terms of how many we're actually able to manage and produce effectively. So we kind of looked at reducing some of the larger events to 4 major events a year. So we reduced a little bit there. In terms of planning, we recognize that we have, this committee will meet monthly, but the community committee meets quarterly. So we just kind of tighten the belt all the way around. I wouldn't say that there's any reduction in the ability to deliver what we need to do. It was just kind of a tightening of the belt and recognizing that we can push some things to FY23 if needed. Just to kind of help the Conservancy come out of the pandemic and make sure cash flows are matching to what we're requesting.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions regarding the FY22 budget requests?
Okay, Kate, this is Jim. Do we have an outline of the early park improvements, the walking trails and all that, and when they're going in? Do we have that?
Yeah, we do. And the mayor probably will share this shortly, but for the August meeting, we're going to suggest that we bring y'all out to tour all of the FY21 early park improvements. And we do have a map that the Conservation Corps created of everything they've installed, so I can share that.
Other questions for Kate? So this is an item that needs leadership approval, Kate?
Yes, so this committee needs to recommend approving this funding request to go to the Conservancy.
Is there a motion to approve the FY22 funding request? Nancy, is there a second? Carlton? All in favor, please raise your hands. Ayes. Ayes have it. The motion carries. Let me also welcome Nancy and Councilman Branch to the meeting.
And Orange, Mayor Baldwin has also joined us, so she
Oh,
is back
Good, she
online.
can take
So
over. All right. Welcome, Mayor. You can take over now.
No, actually, Orange, I'm going to ask you to run the meeting. I had to join by phone, so I'm limited in who I can see. So, yeah, I had some major or have some major computer issues going on right now. So if you wouldn't mind leading us, Orage, I would appreciate it.
All right, well, welcome, and we're glad we can see you anyway. Thank you. Kate, what's the next agenda item?
So the next agenda item is an update on just a recap of the Plaza Play public meeting number 3. And then I will invite our friend Don Bryson to walk us through some transportation analysis for Plaza Play. So I will share my screen again and just share a kind of a quick recap of the meeting. Was it last week? 2 weeks ago? I can't even remember.
2 weeks
now.
ago.
2
Yeah.
weeks ago. So on July 13th, we held our final public meeting for the Plaza. Oh, is Grayson on? Grayson, I saw you.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. Grayson, would you like to do this?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had a really exciting final public meeting for Plaza Play with the design reveal, and MVBA was in town along with several other consultants. We have this really great 13-foot model. We had 2 presentations by Matt Urbanski, and we think we estimated about 250 people total to attend those 2 presentations with 100 views of the live stream. We also had an ASL translator and 2 Spanish translators, and I think that aspect was well received. This is the site plan as it is today, which is what we revealed with the design. Very excited about the elements that it includes. You all are familiar with, we have a sand bowl. This grand stair comes up next to the plaza. The adjustments that have been made to the grand stair, I think, are really great improvements. It allows people, it softens it so it's less hardscape. It brings trees in, more shading. So I think it will have a great day-to-day use, as well as support for any events or performances that may happen in the plaza. We had a nice diversity of those that attended. We had children, we had people in their 20s that came, and we feel like it was great to have people back in person, of course, and people seem to be very enthused about moving forward on it. I'm also excited to announce that we are starting our to work with the public artists through the Percent for Art program. We selected through a very intense selection process. We have 3 artists: Johnny Lee Chapman, who is local, Mark Riegelman and Donald Lipsky are out of New York. And we will have some public engagement associated with this as well. Our first meeting is August 2nd, and it's through Zoom, so hope you all will join. But they've started working with the design team and doing some research on the engagement that we've done to date, so that we can integrate the public art components in with the site design. And then this shows we're cruising along in our process. So we're in design development. We're nearing 100% design development, and we just had that final public meeting, and then we'll move into construction documents that will take us through next summer, and will include permitting. And so once we receive funding, from that point, we'll be ready to break ground.
I know a number of
Oh,
you
go
were
ahead.
able to attend. Go ahead, Orage.
No, I was just going to say, any questions for Grayson? Can I just add that being part of the selection committee for the artists was quite an experience. And I want to tell you folks, there's a wealth of talent out there, and congratulations to the committee for getting it down to the final 3, which I think were all great choices, but boy, did we have a lot of options. So thank you again, committee.
Grayson, can you put the previous slide up that shows the three artists easily?
Kate probably can.
Kate, just as a point of interest, this guy Lipsky is amazing. And it's my understanding that that's a real taxi cab on top of that dog's nose. That's not like a fiberglass model. It's a real vehicle. That's it.
Orange.
Yes, Mayor?
Yeah, I just wanted to commend staff on an excellent job. The first off, the model was amazing. It was well received. I really enjoyed meeting Stefan, who was one of the interns who brought the model down in a U-Haul. It was awesome. And just his reaction to the crowd reaction when they saw this, there was gasping, there were oohs and ahs. I mean, it was really well done, well attended. And I just want to say thank you because I know a lot of hard work went into this.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. Okay. All right. Back to you, Kate.
Great. So the next item is Don Bryson with VHB is joining us. And this is in response to this committee's questions around parking and circulation within the park and some of the assumptions that we've made regarding Plaza and Play. So Don is a member of the MBVA design team, and I know Hillary's on as well. So I'll just turn it over to Don and let him run through his presentation, which I'm sure will generate a lot of questions and discussion.
Thanks, Kate. Just checking, make sure everyone can see the screen, the presentation, and hear me okay?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, I'm gonna hopefully not take too deep a dive into most of the questions we've been getting and hearing are about parking. And so I wanted to address some of those and provide some context, show a little bit of how we approached it and what our findings are suggesting. And I am not moving. Okay, try that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what drives the number of vehicles is park attendance and estimating that. Estimating the peak parking demand, there's a lot of issues there. What's the peak capacity? We looked at it 4 different ways, starting from how many people can you fit in the park to some annual attendance targets, kind of working backwards from that, the standard Institute of Transportation Engineering rates, some case studies of the most similar types of parks we could find. We'll talk a little bit about the parking supply and some of the challenges of going from existing to interim and temporary to ultimately what the master plan suggests, how to get from point A to point B with something that functions adequately for many years in between. We'll look at remote parking, and there've been some discussions about structured parking decks. I put managing parking demand in here. I don't really have any slides. I don't know that we'll get to that. It's kind of spread throughout the presentation. If we have time, we can talk a little bit about that. But that depends more on some of the decisions made above. First thing, just to kind of establish a baseline, this is the kind of the parking paradigm. And this is, we like this chart because it shows, basically it's easy to get any one of these things, typically, inexpensive parking or plentiful or convenient. We can usually come up with a way to satisfy 2 of those. Like it can be convenient and plentiful, but it's going to cost you a lot. Or it can be convenient and inexpensive, but you're not going to have much of it. So it's kind of balancing those trade-offs. And it's always difficult because these aren't fixed objective quantities. Plentiful, what might be plenty for a Tuesday in December is not plenty for a July 4th weekend. So trying to balance those, we typically talk about, we don't design shopping center parking lots for the Black Friday. That would just be, a sea of concrete wasted most of the year. The other thing is that, people's definition of convenient varies, especially if you're having to pay for it. And I think the trickiest one, though, is this idea of cost, because we're talking about this in terms of cost to the user. But even if you give free parking to the user, it's not free. Somebody still has to pay for it at some point. And when you remove costs from the user's decision, it kind of distorts their decisions. It's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. And the idea of how do you sustain this financially. The trickiest thing we're running into, with this park in particular, it's such an unusual one of a kind. If we're predicting parking for an office complex or even a shopping center, we know from lots and lots of examples and that every day is going to be very similar. There'll be some exceptions, but we know it's going to get used a lot, very similar, and we can very reliably predict. This situation, these are discretionary trips that people decide to make when they want to make, and it's influenced by weather, and it's different in winter days are shorter, less people coming just because there's less opportunity. And the conditions will influence trip decisions. It's not like this fixed number of 400 people are going to come to the park at noon. If it's too crowded, people will shift around and find different times to come, adapt their behavior. So we have to try to account for that. We looked at a typical for park attendance versus the spread, where the different days of the week, weekends are different than weekdays, different weeks throughout the year, depending on the season. Peak demand, things that influence the parking demand are how many people per car. That's a critical assumption. When people arrive and leave, how long they stay. If everyone stayed for half an hour, 1,000 people coming evenly spread throughout the day is one thing. If everyone comes at 10 a.m., 1,000 people and stay all day, then obviously we have very different parking demands. So we have to make some assumptions about that and other modes besides driving. And then I talked a little bit about this elasticity, how these ideas of cost, convenience, and availability affect people's behavior, intentionally or unintentionally. Can we use those to influence how people park? So the first, what some of you may have seen, we started with, well, what's the peak capacity of the park? And we'll dig into each of these a little bit more. But that says physically you can fit 9,000 people in the park. But that's a very crush jam capacity, where basically there's about every person is in a 3-foot square box at the same time in all parts of the park. So it might happen, but that's very unlikely, not what we want to design for. Maybe a target for major events, but it's really hard to then take that and factor it down to a normal day. We had heard some people mentioning, a target of 1 million visitors a year. So we said, well, I'm not sure where that came from, but let's assume that's valid and work backwards. What does that translate to in terms of people per day? We looked at the ITE rates, trip generation and parking, vehicle occupancy, and we looked at some case studies. There aren't very many. They're wildly different situations depending on, how walkable is the community? Are there other facilities nearby? Is it new? Is it old? A lot of issues there, but kind of combining all these, we came up with some ideas. This is looking at the different parts of the park and the maximum gathering capacity of just over 9,000. And for most of these, we said we're MBVA, basis on assumption of 10 square foot per person, which is about a 3-foot square box. In the water play area, it's a bigger, like 6-foot by 6-foot box, but that's about 900 people. So that's pretty intense use for all those people to be in all those places at the same time. That translates to about 3,000 spaces. So that's like the ultimate worst case imaginable scenario. Probably not what we're going to design for, but it's on the radar. This one's a little deeper dive. It's an interactive spreadsheet. I won't get into too much, but we said, okay, let's start with the 1 million annual visitors. If that was just spread out evenly throughout the year, that's 2,700 visitors a day, almost well over 19,000 every week. So we said, well, let's say half of the weeks, 26 weeks are around that average. 13, a quarter of those weeks are lower. We said about 50%, and about 25% are higher by 50%. We looked at some other ones here. We said, you know, what if it's 25 and 75? But this seemed to be the most reasonable. Then we said, we know from a lot of studies locally and other places that weekend attendance is about 2.5 times weekday. So we worked that out and found for the average weekday, you know, the low range would be just over 900 people, almost 2,000 on the medium day, and getting up near 3,000 on these highest days. Weekends, obviously much higher, 2,400 up to 7,200. We also know from some studies that the daily peak is usually the peak hour of a park is about 14 or 15% of the daily total. People arrive at that time. So we said, well, let's assume there's 2 hours back to back with 15% of the daily total arriving, and the average stay is 2 hours, which seemed like a reasonable starting point. So that translates to this peak here of attendees of almost 300 on a low day, getting up near 600 on a medium, 865 on a high day, and about 2.5 times that on a weekend. So with the 3 persons per vehicle, that translates to about, on a typical day, almost 200 on a weekday, 500 on a weekend. This is where it got interesting. And the reason those are red, we have basically right now with the parking that's going to be provided and what's available, assuming a lot of employee parking is in place, that we had 176 available spaces on a weekday versus 1,400 on a weekend. So what that told us that we would have some parking problems. We're over 100 short. We really need, say, about 300 to be safe on a high weekday, and we have about 176. Weekends actually look pretty good. And then our future scenario where we looked at, as we'll see, building some additional parking, everything seems to work out pretty well. When we looked at a different option, the ITE spaces per acre, it came out to a daily peak of 700, 750 attendees, which kind of falls in between. That doesn't distinguish between weekday and weekend. So actually, if you average these all out, it comes out pretty close to this. So that suggested we were in the ballpark. We also looked at about the only studies we could find for a similar, what's called an adventure playground. The city of Irvine, California was looking at, and they did some studies of one in Berkeley. It's a little bit different, a little more structured, but definitely same idea of interactive play. And they did some weekend studies looking at, and it's much smaller in terms of attendance, but who arrived by car, who arrived by bike and bus. It's a very similar kind of suburban setting. And what they found was vehicle occupancy ranging from just over 3 to over 3.5 persons per vehicle. And they also used that ITE rate, but actually went with this as being safer. This just kind of translates that it very, very few, almost no one came in a 1-person vehicle, which makes sense for this very child-oriented. I think Plaza and Play might be a little more 1-person attendees because of some of the other attractions, but still it's going to be very low. 2-person, 3-person was the most common cars, but when you look at the number of people who arrived, it's very high. And even though there are fewer 4-person cars, when you start to load 4, 5, and 6 people per car, you get a lot of folks coming in a few vehicles. And this was just to show that distribution on a Sunday, very similar on a Saturday, but the real key was the 3- and 4-person vehicles. So that's how we kind of looked at the demand. Then quickly, what's supply, and trying to get a feel for what's convenient and accessible weekend versus weekday, and just kind of touching on the transition from existing to ultimate. So we looked at what here we considered our 5-minute walk radius, and we tried to focus on parking within a 5-minute walk. It's about 1,000 feet and 10-minute walk radius. Turned out to be double that. Then for special events, we looked at the availability of shuttle parking. And ideally, we wanted shuttle parking that you could walk to if you had to. Sometimes if there's hangups on the bus or you don't want to wait or different. So this 10 to 15-minute walk is actually pretty attractive. 20 to 30, not so much, but people will do it if it's a nice, pleasant walk, or if there's things to do there, or if it's a really big special event. So this is looking again at that maximum crush capacity that we needed, 3,000 spaces to get 9,000 people. We factored that down to other special events on a weekend. Probably about 4,000 people seemed about right. 3,000 to 4,000 range would be what you'd be looking at. About 1,300, 1,400 spaces. Typical weekend, typical weekday. So whereas our other calculations, we were coming up with that we need a total of 300, maybe 400 spaces during a weekday. This approach gave us something significantly higher. It wasn't so far off on the weekend. But having 900 people there at once on a weekday seems pretty high. Just to kind of test that. So in calculating our existing weekend parking inventory, we had sort of this A area, which is everything that was in the 5-minute radius, which is 1,200 some spaces. We looked at B, we didn't really need it, so we didn't spend a lot of time on these. And we know that healing transition, we identified it, but it's not really count that as an option. What we found here is without additional parking, that kind of building some of the master plan parking early that we'll look at in a second. Things were pretty good except for the maximum max capacity, and that scenario is always going to require shuttles. But we were running into some problems if we assume we need 450 some spaces, that we would need an additional 200 and some for the typical weekday. Again, I think that's a little high, but that's kind of the upper range. We looked at some temporary lot locations, some places we could lay down fairly easily gravel or pave and be walkable without being too disruptive, and came up with a few more spaces that we'll look at. So that's same view. And then we looked at some future proposed parking additions. This would be laying down some ultimately permanent parking lots that would serve the park as a whole over here, and then what's been identified as the Plaza and Play parking. So that gives us 150 some Plaza and Play, and then up to close to 400 here. We could do some or all of that. And that really takes care of all the situations, except again, the maximum crush scenario. And I also want to point out, we've assumed everyone's coming by car. So if like based on the Berkeley study, if 10% of people either got dropped off, came by bus, walked, like, then that vehicle occupancy equivalently would go down to 2.7. So that or a reduction in parking of another 10%. So I think again, we're pretty conservative here. Okay, rounded up here. There've been some questions about structured parking. We haven't spent a whole lot of time on that, but I wanted to just hit some of the key issues to consider. Siting size and layout, costs, both construction and maintenance and operation, and debt load, and how to fund that. So we looked, there's some basic deck sizes that are efficient. If you look over at the Centennial, this is kind of the standard footprint for the least expensive deck. That's 400 spaces, 3 level with 3 bays, could be turned either way. And that is kind of the most cost effective. And this was the kind of the best place we could find to put something like that. It wouldn't be too far, but also is in a site that's buildable. So 400 spaces, but it does displace about, I think it's 80 spaces under here. So you have to always be looking at the net gain. Another thing we thought would be interesting, we've seen some other places, is not a deck, but a shelf, just building, and this is kind of on a slight grade, but just building a separate deck, a lid on top of the surface parking. And that helps a lot because you don't have to deal with the waste of ramps and different things. It's much simpler. And you can kind of be much more efficient with that and get the 2 levels, about 300 spaces gross. But the question we always have to ask is, why not just provide more capacity for cars? Okay, a surface space, a nice, and I think we're probably looking at something that has landscaping and lighting, and it isn't just your standard gravel or asphalt rectangular lot. Would be about 1,500 up, could be 5,000 per space, depending on the conditions. Structured 10,000, 30,000. We've run into 70 and 90,000 if you have to go underground or deal with difficult conditions. And that's not a fancy deck with a lot of ornate features or aesthetic treatments. Turns out when you start looking at debt service, maintenance, repair, operations, security, lighting, it turns out you need about $1,500 a year per space in a deck. And that's not considering the opportunity cost. If there's something else you want to be doing with that money or that land, and the displaced parking. We've also found from especially our university work that if you try to charge for a deck, you find out what people are really willing to pay. And as you raise the fees, suddenly the demand goes down. And people who will be upset, if parking's all free and someone parks 50 feet away and I have to park 500 feet away, I'm a little bit resentful. If that person 50 feet away has to pay $1 and I can get free parking 500 feet away, I'm feeling pretty good. I've beat the system. So it's kind of interesting how the psychology works. But if we really want to reduce single occupancy vehicle use in the park, it's a combination of providing good alternatives and managing the parking, being realistic about the supply, demand, and cost. And this is an older example, quite a bit pre-pandemic. So these numbers have not gone down. They've probably gone up, but we looked, this is a project in Greensboro, 650 spaces. Theirs worked out to 20,000 per space. So it was a $13 million investment. They displaced some spaces though. So actually they only gained 500. So it worked out to be $26,000 per space. Debt service on that worked out to basically $2,000 a year per space. And then because that affected their debt ratio, the actual cost to them in terms of being able to borrow money was about $2,600 per space per year for 30 years. At that time, they were charging, they just raised the fee from $370 to $445. So that was what they're wrestling with, is this gap. And it's one thing when you have a university where there's classes and people don't have a choice and they're using this thing almost every day, or downtown. But when you have the situation here where you never really know how many people are going to be there, and there's going to be lots of times when that deck is very empty, it gets really hard to justify that. And it's not like someone will donate money for naming rights for a fountain or a pavilion. I've yet to see a parking deck get named after anyone. That's the main things I wanted to cover, kind of the background of what we had uncovered. We have some extra slides if you want to talk about access, but
I think if you'll drop your presentation and so we can see if there are any questions from the group. And to summarize, oh yeah, go ahead, Alicia.
I'm sorry, and you popped down the presentation, but you know, I think we've had conversations with the city, and NC State is very willing to have conversations about parking and, you know, large events and those types of things. So I'll preface my question with that, but it did appear that in your AB graphic, were you including the University Spring Hill parking lot in your numbers? I just want to make sure. Yeah, up in the left-hand
Up in here?
Yeah, the far left. I just want to make sure that you're not counting on that capacity on a day-to-day basis, because at least by my view of the map, is that the NC State parking lot?
No,
Yeah.
that's the Kirby building lot,
We're up.
Alicia. I don't.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm a block off here. Okay, never mind. I just wanted to make sure that your analysis wasn't counting on spaces that I wasn't sure I could provide, you know, all of the time, that we weren't going to be able to offer. All right, I apologize. I was out of geography on the map.
No,
All right.
no, and that's one of the things is the trying to wrap your arms and mind around the geography is challenging. And it turned out we don't need any of this B for it's just too scattered and too far, and we know it's not going to be there long term. So we really focused on A, and anyone that parked out here, it would be hard to even pick them up and locate them with a shuttle. It'd take a lot of work to make this function. So we really focused on the A, and then if there were to be other events, it would be more efficient and getting people in and out and serving with buses to do things like the parking decks, like has been done in the past.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
things like this or that. It's just
Right,
such a deep shot.
Don, the key finding here, if I'm interpreting your results, is based on the demand analysis, we're short about 208 or about 300 spaces during the weekday. And that's because we're not accounting for any of the HHS available space. This is just what's available to us today. And so I just want that to sink in for this group, that our weekday demand, we don't have enough supply to meet our weekday demand.
And I just want to emphasize with that, most of this was pre-COVID or during COVID. It was really hard to get a handle. I'm not sure, especially as things, if and when they get back to normal. My feeling is there is space in the DHHS. It's just kind of scattered around. If we could kind of squeeze them to make better use of the space farther west, I'm pretty sure we'd get pretty close to the 300 we need if we could just more efficiently manage what's there. But if not, you know, that's where these other options of building a few new sites seem to be the only other choice.
David?
My office is downtown, right on Eden Street, next to the History Museum and the Museum of Natural Sciences. And pre-COVID, during certain times of the spring and even early summer, I bet there's 1,000 school kids a day down here. And if any of those were to ever migrate on a regular basis to Plaza and play, have we taken those numbers into consideration? And also parking the buses they come in, because a bus eats up a lot of real estate.
Yeah, we've looked at that some, and we feel pretty comfortable with that because buses can be parked very remotely, drop off, and they don't have to be nearby. It's more the matter of how that circulation would work, and that's where the Dow Adams extension makes things a little easier. You know, it would be take a little more care to make it work in the meantime there, you know, to get everybody out of each other's way. But there are some good options. We can work out those details if interested, but it would change, our recommendations would change with Dow Adams being constructed.
Hey, Don, this is Orge. Have you all looked at what people are willing to accept in terms of time and distance to a location. And what I'm thinking about is we've got all of those parking decks downtown. And if we had a running bus service or tram service or however you want to identify it, that gets you back and forth to the park to downtown, would that be acceptable? Is that a 10-minute ride from, point A to point B?
Yeah, I think there are ways you could make a very attractive shuttle system from downtown. I think that would serve people who were downtown, that they didn't feel they had, especially if they had to go to a parking deck and get their car and drive it out and go and come back. So something like lunchtime, or if they're there for a convention, I think that would be very useful. I don't think people driving from suburbs would be inclined to park downtown and take something like that back to the park. I almost have to drive past the park somewhere downtown and come back out to that seems a little less likely. But I think if we could, there isn't one answer to this. It's going to be, slicing different parts of the pie. But I think if we could serve people living, working, visiting downtown, that this becomes a very easy trip, then yeah, that's definitely part of the market and part of the solution.
Thank you. Other questions for Don?
Yeah, Don, one thing I found really interesting was your idea of working with DHHS on this parking consolidation model to access more of their daytime parking. And I think that's something that we'll want to continue to think about and study. Our most recent conversations with DHHS is that they're not returning to 100% occupancy on campus. They're kind of flexing and returning around 30 to 40% occupancy, and adjusting work schedules and all of those things. So I think there's more follow-up to be done there, because that's an interesting alternative to building more now versus waiting until the campus relocation to take advantage of existing parking.
Yeah, well, my own experience over there, our office in Centennial campus, we're not looking at everyone coming back every day. And I was one of the people who gave up their parking pass because it's just not warranted when I do come in. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I would hate to, when I started in this business, we were mainly being asked, where should I build the next parking deck and how big should it be? And now it's like, how do I avoid building one parking deck too many? It would be a shame to front load all those costs and the idea of a parking facility first that ends up not being needed. I think we have options that we can do in stages and work with managing different ways of dealing with these special events until we get a better feel for how things work. I mean, a lot of this, what I found in looking at other similar parks, is how much is driven by the programming. Well, when trips like those school trips or other events are scheduled, if you stack them all on top of each other, you're going to have a lot more demand. If you can stagger them, it really can pay off and give a better user experience too.
Any other questions for Don at this time?
Yeah, Don, this is Jim. So how many different places did you identify to park on a typical day or a typical weekend? How many different locations would the public have to know about?
Yeah, that was actually something, and that's part of that consolidation idea, that we really want to try to get all the parking we can along Biggs and Palmer Drive that's accessible off of there, so it makes it easier for wayfinding. And most of what we found, these are some of the temporary lots we identified. if needed. But most of it is along Biggs. If we built some more early master plan parking along Ruggles and a little bit here on Palmer, and then obviously the main Plaza and Play parking. But those are really what we focused on.
Yeah,
Jim,
I found that a difficulty is you can identify these lots. And then how do you let everybody know where they are?
Now that's something we were wrestling with. And that's the idea that, yeah, there are spaces back here, but how do you find them? How do you direct people to them? And the idea if we could kind of consolidate the HHS parking over here, then we could start to identify, here's where you go in for this many spaces, and here's where there's some others, and that kind of thing that would be primarily fed off Biggs, maybe Ruggles.
Jim, to get to your question, we working with some of our colleagues in our department, we're actually kind of doing an analysis of what accessibility, lighting, wayfinding improvements are needed at these more remote parking locations to help people get to Plaza Play. So kind of as a complement to this work, we're starting that work to evaluate these existing lots and see what improvements would need to be made in terms of accessibility, lighting, safety, and wayfinding to get people from, the lot behind the gym to Plaza Play. So that piece of work is starting right now.
And I think the key part of that, where these two intersect, is we definitely would rather have, say, one lot with 100 spaces than 5 lots with 20 spaces. That kind of gets very difficult to manage.
This is Nancy. I have a question. I actually have 2 questions. One is, do you have any experience? I know that I have seen, to your point about building a parking deck and doing that expense for something that you may not need later. I have seen parking decks, they're being built in cities with that very concern, but they're built with the ability to adapt to become condominiums or different things. Obviously, it's a different type of construction. The slopes are different. The spacing is a little different. Do you have any experience, or can you talk about that at all?
There's actually two approaches to that. You can do them with the idea of retrofitting or future fitting them to be something else. That does raise costs, and it's kind of a gamble. What I think might be more the way things are going is the idea of almost a Lego set, a temporary build it, when it's not needed, take it down and put it up somewhere else. That seems to be the direction that some structures are going, knowing, this isn't permanent, but this, concrete lasts 100 years, you do it right, that you then build it in a way that it can be moved and reused somewhere.
Okay. Now, other question is, where you showed the potential space actually works, because we are going to have an amphitheater not too far from there.
Yeah.
So sort of thinking down the road, there are going to be more amenities in this area that need parking. And also to that, some of the parking areas that we're talking about using will probably become lay down areas for construction as we start working on buildings and upgrading and all that kind of stuff. So I guess that's just sort of a moving target we work on as we're going along, which kind of goes back to Orig's request for a 10-year plan.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And that's why, in my mind, the parking problem is going to get easier as the park gets bigger rather than harder. This is the starting point is probably, in the next 10 years, is probably the hardest to solve.
Okay.
Any
All
other
right.
questions? Oh, go ahead.
Just one comment on what Nancy just said. When when I was out in LA, ULI conference, one of the places they took us to was, well, a TOD area, transit-oriented development. And there was big focus on what Nancy was just talking about, and that is like parking structures that could be converted. But not only that, this particular parking structure, you drove in and it was mechanical. So it wasn't a person or you finding the parking space. Your car is picked up and moved to a parking space. And then when you come back, it's retrieved for you. And they were saying that they had sold, I think it was 200, they have 200 parking spaces, but they sold 200 permits. 250 permits. And when we asked about that, they said, we have never had an issue because not everybody is here at the same time. And not everybody, comes to and parks here for work every day. So I think that's something to think about. I think we're thinking too heavily on how we do it now, and maybe not thinking what the future is going to bring 10, 20 years from now. And I would hate to see us overbuild parking because that does not exactly add to the beauty of a park. That's all.
Good point. Thank you. Yeah. Good point. Good ideas. Yeah.
So Art,
yeah, Jim.
Art, yeah, but this is just, I just want to make this is just an idea, a notion. And that we are building a world-class park. Now that requires world-class parking. Problem is always, parking is always talked about as the problem. Right, so we get in sort of a mindset of mitigating a problem, not creating an advantage or an opportunity, right? That's how we all think about parking. Oh, hell, it's not enough parking. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And I'm just, I don't know what world-class parking is. I guess it's close. I don't know what it is, but I sure want to work on our mindset about we want world-class in this just like we do everything else.
Good point, Jim. Absolutely. Other comments, suggestions, ideas, observations? All right. Well, Don, thank you for the presentation. We certainly will look forward to more as we get deeper into this project. The points are made, we're going to build a world-class park and we're going to have all the amenities that are world-class to make it happen. So here we go. Kate?
Appreciate the time. And if anyone has any questions, just let me know, or through Kate or anyone. And it's definitely going to be evolving. So input is welcome.
Thank you. Get that gondola idea going, would you?
I've got sketches.
All right, Kate, what's next?
Yep. The last item on the agenda is a discussion of the implementation plan and where we stand. And so in your packet of information, we shared a draft proposal from the Development Finance Initiative that really is going to help us move this discussion forward. And so I'm going to share my screen again. We have been working over the past month or so with the Development Finance Initiative at the UNC School of Government. And DFI really exists to help communities with public-private partnerships by providing finance and real estate expertise. And so the scope of work that has been proposed will evaluate the buildings per the Dix Park Master Plan for preservation and reuse with an emphasis on identifying projects that complement the principles and vision of the master plan. So DFI's work will really focus on the financial and kind of organizational side of things. And then they will work hand in hand with a team of consultants that will think about, that will investigate the site. So looking at the buildings, looking at the infrastructure systems, looking at the connections to, at the end of it, basically have a recommendation around how to move forward with the existing assets. And then what does that mean for the financial and operational model of the park? So what I wanted to do is just kind of highlight the scope of work for you. It does include kind of a fairly traditional planning process that starts with community engagement. There will be regular engagement with this committee and the community committee to really establish, based on the master plan, additional guiding principles for building reuse renovation for the project. They are also going to look at a parcel and market analysis. And so this is the idea of what is the potential demand for different uses within the park, but also what's happening around the park's edges. So what are the sales trends and changes in ownership outside of the park to look at kind of a greater geography than just what's inside our 308 acres. The city will issue an RFQ to engage a team of consultants to work with DFI to do the physical site work. So the site work as it relates to infrastructure, the building work as it relates to code reviews, and what would it take to bring some of these buildings up to standard and provide reuse opportunities. So DFI will be working with this secondary team of consultants to complete this site analysis, which will then feed into a financial feasibility. So what are the mix of uses? What are the institutional uses and other uses that could potentially go into some of these buildings? What are the development finance tools available to us, like historic tax credits, to at the end of it come out with a financial model that looks at the future financial operations of the park to help us make some decisions around the feasibility of building reuse and renovation. The project will also work to establish the criteria and framework for the identification and selection of partners, and create a portfolio of opportunities that we could potentially market to potential partners or with regard to kind of building tenants. And so I'm really excited about getting this work going because I think it advances a lot of the work we did in the master plan and it's going to help us establish the framework to evaluate things like the 12 proposals that we've already received from community groups who are interested in locating at the park. So we are in the process of contracting with DFI to get this work going. We are also in the process of developing the RFQ for the team of consultants that will investigate the site to work with the city and DFI. And so all of this is kind of the next big step in implementing the master plan. Now, last meeting, the mayor also asked us to go ahead and think about marbles and how we push that conversation forward. And so in addition to this work, we are working to evaluate opportunities for marbles to locate adjacent to Plaza Play, conduct a high level analysis of those existing buildings and systems around there, and to also develop a good understanding of the impacts and opportunities that a relocation of a large institution like Marbles will have on the park and on Plaza Play. So that work will be getting going shortly, and we're amending MVVA's current contract to accomplish that work. So it's kind of a multi-tiered project But what I wanted to share with y'all is just this overall project coordination schedule that looks to develop this kind of implementation plan over the next 14 to 18 months, but early on get this Marbles feasibility work done almost as a pilot of what our future process will look like once we come out of it. So the draft scope was in your packet. We are happy to answer any questions, but we think this is the right next step to advance how we're going to build the park, especially when it comes to buildings.
Well,
Kate, let me
needless
ask.
to-
Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Archie.
No, go ahead.
Okay, Kate, you talked about the existing buildings. Does this propose commercial uses or institutional uses or anybody who will pay rent? And does this address mostly self-generated funding opportunities from the park, or does this look at other outside financing, municipal, TIF, TIG, all that sort of stuff as well wrapped into this study?
All of the above. So it is looking at development finance tools within the park and also what's happening around the park. And then in terms of the mix of uses, obviously everything is park forward, park centric, but it is going to help the community committee and this committee have that exact conversation about the appropriate mix of uses for earned income purposes.
Thank you.
Kate, what I was going to ask is DFI, during the study, they will bring timely updates to this group, or how will they communicate with everyone?
Yes, so as part of their scope of work, the two main stakeholder groups that they will work with are the community committee and this committee. So we will basically schedule conversation, updates, and presentations with both the community committee and this committee to first, I mean, obviously it's got to benefit the park and benefit the public, and then to talk about kind of the financial side of things as well. So they will be working hand in hand with staff, this committee, the community, and the community committee.
Thank you. Nancy?
Hey, can you put that chart back up for a second, please?
Sure. This one?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the feasibility study on the Rocky Branch project won't be done for 2 years. I feel like we've been working on it for 5.
Yeah, so it is a 18-month process. So
I know, but we've been working on it. We've been doing borings. We've been doing all this stuff. I guess I don't understand why it's going to be 2 more years before the feasibility is even done.
And I think it's a good follow-up to this. What I'll do is also send around the scope of work for that, because it's the amount of technical work that goes into this feasibility project is pretty extensive. And so while we've been collecting data, we haven't actually been doing any feasibility work. We've just been collecting, or we haven't even been collecting, the state's been collecting data for the past couple of years. So our first phase of, or our first part of this Rocky Branch project is actually to evaluate all that data that the state's been collecting. And does that shorten the time frame? It might, or the consultants might tell us you need to collect more data. So we just don't have the information yet to understand that. But that's what this first phase of work for Rocky Branch is. The first phase of the feasibility study is going to answer for us. So yeah, the state's been collecting data, but it hasn't been relevant to the realignment of the creek.
Okay, so back to Origin. Sorry, Origin, I keep dragging your 10-year plan. right, we got Plaza Play going. We're gonna spend 2 years doing a feasibility study on Rocky Branch, which may come out and say, you know what, that's not really gonna work. What else you got? I mean, I feel like we need to be, I mean, and I get it, it's staffing and it's money, but you know, I feel like we need to be looking at multiple what's next, what's the next thing that we think we're gonna do. And at some time, David, I'd love for this group to get an update on what's going on with the farmer's market too, if anything.
David, are you there?
I'm here. Do you want that update now or sometime in the future?
Yeah, I mean,
David, yeah, if you, I mean, we can add it to an upcoming agenda, or if you just wanted to share kind of if anything has been going on. I know we've been working, the city's been working closely with the farmers market on the transportation improvements.
Sure. As some of you may know, we're putting in a new driveway to connect the farmers market to Lake Wheeler Road. In fact, we met with the city last week on that. That is going a little bit slower than we had anticipated, but we got all the permits now. As far as other issues at the market, it's just a matter of money for us. The pandemic has had a big impact on our financial standing, and that's a self-sustaining enterprise, self-supporting enterprise, and we're just on hold with money right now. So that's a quick and dirty.
okay, thank you.
Other questions, comments regarding DFI?
I just want to follow up, Orage. I think it would be helpful if we had David do a more like a report on the farmers market that he has time to prepare for. So maybe that's an item for an agenda, item on our agenda for the future.
Sure.
Thank you.
Kate and David can work that out. Thank you.
And David, this is Jim now. If there's a lot of money over at the state, and if you all come up with something, we'll be glad to help you if we can. Right, to get some money for the project.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we realize there's a lot of money over at the state, and in fact, I'll give you a highlight on that. Each week I get an update from the controller's office on the unreserved cash balance for the state. Last Friday, that number was a little over $8 billion. The one I got this week is a little over $9 billion. But the problem is, just to be honest about it, Jim, is that, you know, the leadership in the General Assembly, they're more tight-fisted than you are.
That's saying something. Well, David, if there's anything we can do to you know, help, you know, get some of that money, just let us know. You know, we're willing to, you know, make calls, go over and talk to folks. Because we really want to see the farmers market redone. It's just critical to everything else that we're doing.
Sure.
And frankly, you know, we talked a lot about how much this meant to the commissioner and wanted to see it done while he's there. So
Sure.
I'll just echo what Ord said. We're all happy to help.
Hey, back to your question about comments on the proposal or the path forward. It looked, I reviewed the proposal and it looks robust and thorough. I would only add that, you know, Chuck Flink and NC State's Community Development Group would be happy to partner and collaborate with the folks from UNC as this process moves forward. I know they're eager to continue to be engaged in the park, so I'll put that out there as well.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Alicia. We appreciate that. Kate, what's next on the agenda?
That's it. So next on the agenda is just open around the table discussions and questions and adjournment.
Well, we'll open it up for comments, questions from the committee. Anything on your mind? Anything we want the mayor to know or other members? All right, when's our next meeting, Kate?
So our next meeting is the 4th Tuesday of August, and it is, the mayor and I touched base yesterday, and we'd like to do that as an in-person tour of the early park improvements. We will have representatives from our Youth Conservation Corps there. They're the ones that helped build a lot of that this summer, and the work that they've accomplished is pretty amazing. So, and then it will end at the Plaza Play site with a tour of that with Grayson. And I think we'll be able to look at some of the adjacent buildings and others just to give people a really good sense of the site and what we're talking about in terms of adjacencies as well. So if the group's amenable, we will have golf carts and get everyone together in person and see some of these park improvements, and then end our meeting over at the Plaza Play, really getting a feel for the site and some of those building adjacencies.
So the next meeting, the last Thursday or last Tuesday in August will be a field trip. Will it start at 9 or earlier?
It'll be a 9 o'clock start, August 24th.
Okay. All right. Anything else from the committee?
I just think that going out to the site is a great idea. Help us visualize what we're working on, and thank you, Kate, for sharing that. And I really appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing everyone in person. That'll be great.
Likewise, Mayor. All right. If there's nothing else to discuss, our meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.